At 2 a.m. on June 14th, 2013, a young man regained consciousness, handcuffed to a police station bench in rural Massachusetts, wearing nothing but his boxers and a vomit-covered t-shirt while his Miranda rights were being read to him. In celebration, he and a friend had over-imbibed, blacked out, and gotten lost on their dark, rainy trek home from the bar. While he had managed to make it home to pass out in his own bed, his friend had gotten lost and ended up to the back door of a house in a quiet residential neighborhood demanding to be let in. The police were called, and in no condition to explain his actions, he was arrested. An hour later, that young man was marked as accomplice, forcibly pulled from his bed, and arrested as well. The next day, both of them were dragged, dazed and confused, into a courtroom, charged with felony attempted break-in and entering, malicious destruction of property, trespassing, and disorderly conduct. The fallout of that young man's mistake hit him fast and hard. He had to empty his bank account to get the charges dismissed in court, lost his job a week before it was set to begin, took a Craigslist job teaching English in China, and returned stateside to work countless part-time temporary jobs in Boston. He exchanged the voluntary life of poverty through a year of national service for an involuntary one in the real world. He had to ration his food for months, waiting for his food stamps to be reinstated, and he became a guinea pig for research studies just to pay his rent. That young man lost his third job in 12 months, which left him homeless for the remainder of the summer. Depressed and defeated, the only hope he held on to was the prospect of moving to Detroit at the end of the summer. Almost a year ago to this day, that young man packed all of his belongings in a rented minivan and moved to the city of Detroit. Now, Detroit didn't end up in a vomit-covered t-shirt and his boxers chained to a bench in a police station, but a month after that young man was arrested, Detroit filed for the largest municipal bankruptcy in the history of the United States due to the unsurmountable $18.5 billion in debt that it held. Decades of decline, neglect, and corruption had taken their toll. The two made quite a pair. Detroit desperately needing young professionals to move to the city to create investment and talent there, and the young man, having accepted a unique job opportunity in the city, was desperate for someone or something to invest in him. Both had experienced significant hardships, and both were desperate to move on. So why does that young man matter? Well, the 2-year anniversary of my fateful night in jail came and went this past June when I was living in Detroit. Elated and swept up by the purposeful life I was living in Detroit, I didn't have time to remorse or regret over that fateful night and what it had done to change my life. Indicative of our shared story, Detroit emerged from bankruptcy this past December, about the same time that I overcame my depression to accept the life that I was living now. 2, how is Detroit? To be honest, I feel like someone asks me this question almost every day, and again, to be honest, I feel like there's no appropriate way to answer it. It's a loaded question because you know the biases that people carry into this question and these conversations, and it's also a question that is deeply ingrained in for people who live there and work there. To me, Detroit is that good-looking, smooth-talking, popular kid who peaked in high school. Detroit really excelled in the working-class confines of production, consumption, and growth to become the pinnacle of our global industry. But when post-industrial America hit, Detroit's peers matured, graduated, left, and went on to pursue higher things. Detroit stayed, deeply holding on to that working class mentality and trying to do the same things that it had always done with its Rust Belt friends. Detroit grew up to be that over-the-hill, washed-up used car salesman. Detroit is out of shape through years of declining public and private investment, bloated with blighted, abandoned property. Detroit is also out of touch. It has the same mileage of dedicated public transit as Accra, Ghana, Beirut, Lebanon, and Durban, South Africa, respectively. In a city designed for the automobile, a majority of its residents can't even afford to own them because it has the highest automotive insurance premiums in the country. Likewise, while 50% of the world lives in cities, native Detroiters have been escaping the city for the better part of the past century. when it was at its peak of 1.86 million people in 1950, today it has roughly 700,000 residents living within it. Recently, Detroit has looked in the mirror, slapped itself in the face, and decided to start reinvesting. There's a consensus forming from the city's leadership right on down to its youth surrounding Detroit's failures and what should be done about them. Today Detroit is honest, Detroit is vulnerable. It is coming to terms with the fact that it no longer has to project its inflated automotive ego throughout the world. The day that I ended up in jail at 23, or the night that I ended up in jail at 23, my life came collapsing down around me, and I lost sight of my future. Now, for any of you in this room who consider yourself entrepreneurial, progressive, or even just optimists, I want you to take what I'm about to say to heart. All loss is opportunity. In Detroit, there is a large narrative that everyone here has probably heard of about the abandoned, blighted property that exists there. It's notorious for the arson and vandalism committed against it, but it also has trap houses and death traps for people who live within it. This is a stock photograph off of Flickr of an abandoned, blighted property in Detroit, also known as ruin porn, for anyone who has heard that term before. When you see this house, you might take it for face value. You might think it's worthless, you might think it's decrepit, you might think it needs to be destroyed. When I see this house, I think of someone's new residence, I think of a new business, I see a mixed-use development, I think of an artist space, an artist installation, or even a hydroponic fishing farm. Now, if you want to remove that structure and the buildings on the property, you can also have reclaimed green space, you can have an urban garden, or you can have a community park. I've always loved to travel, but since living in Detroit, I've adopted a new lens through which I view the world. Whenever I go to a new city, I no longer look for its successes, for its failures, for its tourist attractions. I see it for its potential. I imagine what a city can become, and I seek out the people who are actively trying to make that city into something greater than what it currently is. It's amazing what can happen to your perspective when you start to realize that all loss is opportunity. Now, in Detroit, most, if not all, of the people who have moved or who currently live there have adopted this mentality. They either see Detroit for a new business, for an entrepreneurial opportunity, for a place where social justice can occur, where the eyes of the world are upon them and they can prove themselves or help other people make their lives better. Now, turning my perspective to my 4 years in Beloit, I could say I'm ashamed of the way that I experienced my time here. It's unfortunate I didn't have this perspective through which I could view the world. It almost leaves a bad taste in my mouth to think about the way that my friends and I sometimes talked about the city itself. We were stuck in that small liberal arts bubble. We wouldn't leave campus. We would stay on campus. We'd get in our cars. We'd go to where we needed to, and we'd return. So today, when I hear someone complain about the city where they live in or the place where they go, I ask to myself, and sometimes propose to them, if a city is so boring, if a city has nothing going for it, if you can't wait to leave it, A, why are you even here? 2, why aren't you the one who's making it better? Living in Detroit is extremely humbling. I know every pothole that I pass on my way to work. I've come across packs of wild dogs in the city while surveying land. I have been brought to tears while driving down Grand River Avenue from the suburbs, taken aback by the desolation that has taken place there and the diminished quality of living affecting people who live just miles from where I rest my head at night. Every day is an exercise in empathy and privilege. Now, I don't mean to sensationalize Detroit, but there are harsh realities that exist there. To spend every day living with people who have had their basic human rights slowly stripped away from them for decades is unequivocally sobering. I am in Detroit to be a reflection of the people who currently live there. Although I could easily project my schemes and solutions for the city's problems upon it, it is not my place to do so. Detroit is nearly 85% African American and has been around for 314 years. So I do not aim to be Detroit's educated white savior, and I also do not, and Detroit is also not my blank canvas. Support is crucial. Prior to moving to Detroit, I knew one person in that city, one. The day after I moved to Detroit, I met a cohort of 34 other young professionals who I'd spend the next year of my life working alongside. Together, we approached urban revitalization in the city through large-scale nonprofit consultation projects with social enterprises and nonprofits doing influential work within the city's limits. How did I introduce myself to a city of strangers and new coworkers on a stage like this, telling my story, making myself completely vulnerable for the world to see? There's something so empowering about admitting your drunken failures and adult insecurities. It creates openness, or fosters openness, creates understanding, and begins to develop genuine relationships. Challenge Detroit for me became a holistic community, or holistic intentional community that supported me socially, professionally, personally. Challenge Detroit also isn't alone in the city of Detroit. There are so many professional organizations, co-working spaces, networking events, professional organizations, entrepreneurs, business leaders, community members, and educators that are effectively collaborating, inspiring, and supporting each other to make a difference in Detroit. A lot of these Detroit-centric programs exist to create a platform and prepare Detroiters, new and old, to make a tangible impact in their city. These small enclaves of concentrated people are making steady, transformative changes in the city of Detroit that will only continue to grow. Now, that one friend I had prior to moving to Detroit, she directs programs for an organization that provides entrepreneurs with the resources, connections, and skills that they need to launch their businesses in Detroit. To date, her organization has graduated over 600 people from their programs, and most notably, they have been an effective champion of equitable community economic development. Also, fortunately, not all of the graduates look like me. They are African American, they are women, they are actually representative of the city of Detroit, which in Rust Belt cities can become challenging as people move in, they gentrify, and they push out native populations. I think Beloit is actually primed to do the same thing. Beloit College, in fact. It has one of the strongest intentional communities I've ever experienced, and it also has these small enclaves of students with shared interests and similar passions. The one thing I would say to the college itself is to challenge itself to better reflect the community that supports the institution as a whole. When you have opportunity, perspective, and support, a city really opens itself up to you. Most, if not all of you, are probably familiar with the social theory 6 degrees of separation. It's the idea that at most, every single person is connected by 6 relationships or less. Now, turned Hollywood pop culture game, 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon is an iteration of that theory that sees how many professional Hollywood roles it takes to connect any actor or any director or any member of the Hollywood community to Kevin Bacon. Play that game with influential leaders in the Detroit community, and you'll be hard-pressed to find more than 1 or 2 degrees of separation between them. Now, native Detroiter Jeanette Pierce says it best with her trademark quote, which is, "Detroit is big enough to matter in the world and small enough for you to matter in it." Jeanette about 15 years ago, Jeanette founded an organization which sole purpose for existence is to introduce people to the city she loves. And she does so with this message and with this intention. Detroit might fail when it comes to a lot of traditional measurements of city success, but if you look at the instance of the 2 degrees of separation that exists between influential people in the city, I think you discover a metric that truly reveals the untapped potential in the city of Detroit. Part of me wishes I could fast forward from the events that happened to me a little over 2 years ago, through the 10 hours I spent in handcuffs, through the year I spent living in poverty. Now, the quote I'm about to show you has actually been in my personal email signature for the better part of those 2 years, and it has served as a mantra for me at times where I didn't have my own vision or outlook, and I couldn't see past feeding myself that day or paying my rent. As a rule, I don't like suffering to no purpose. Suffering should be creative, should give birth to something good and lovely. The story of Detroit and myself is one of shared hardship, because it has been our hardships rather than our successes who have defined who we truly are. And in embracing our hardships, we have been able to learn from our mistakes and have had an eagerness to grow from them. I will never be perfect, and neither will Detroit. Like, for example, I still drink, and Detroit is far from a thriving city. But, for example, I better understand my relationship with alcohol, and Detroit is beginning to understand how to better reflect the needs of its citizens. The last quote I have for you is, some people move to great cities, others make cities great. Now, this is a challenge for any students or ambitious change makers who might be in the room or watching this broadcast. When you graduate or pack up your belongings and plan to move to a new city, instead of considering a place like Chicago, New York, or San Francisco, consider a place like Detroit, or even stay in a place like Beloit. Rust Belt cities offer unrivaled opportunity for young people to discover, define, and prove themselves for the world to see. As my parting words and final advice, I would say it's crucial to find a place that values you for the impact you can make and invites you for the talent that you have. Invest yourself in any city that you go to, and I promise that investment will pay dividends. Thank you.